The 1912 sinking of the luxury liner Titanic shocked the world. Here are some little-known survivor stories that reveal some of the horror and bravery of that event. The orphans. Michel Navratil Sr., like many other European immigrants at that time, dreamt of a better life in America. He was in the midst of a divorce from his wife, who had gained custody of their two children, Michel and Edmond, when Navratil decided to make a bid for a new beginning. Navratil gained permission from their mother, Marcel, to take the two boys, then aged 2 and 3 years, during the Easter break. He then seized the opportunity to abscond with his children and head to the New World. Unfortunately, he chose the Titanic for his daring escape, registering the family as second-class passengers using false names to avoid being tracked by the French police. Michel Jr. later recalled the experience starting as an enjoyable holiday where, as he looked down the length of the hull, the ship was a splendid sight. He and his brother would play on the forward deck and were thrilled to be on board. The tragic night that the ill-fated ship struck an iceberg, Navratil Sr. entered his family's cabin with another unidentified man, and together they carried the two small boys down to the lifeboats. Michel Jr. and Edmond got one last glimpse of their father as he placed them into the lifeboat, the very last lifeboat to leave the ship. Although only 3 at the time, Michel Jr. never forgot his father's message to his mother, that he still loved her dearly and had been expecting her to follow them, to live happily in the peace and freedom of the New World. The boy's father sadly perished in the icy waters, leaving his 2 surviving sons, the only children, to be rescued from the disaster without a parent or guardian. In the media frenzy following the horrendous sinking, Michel Jr. and Edmond became quite a media sensation. They were temporarily cared for in the home of another friendly French-speaking survivor, Margaret Hayes, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, as the authorities tried to track down their relatives. Because the 2 children, dubbed the Titanic orphans, spoke no English and had been travelling under the false names John and Fred Hoffman, this proved a very difficult task. A 1912 newspaper article described how the children responded to questions from the French consul with a simple "oui" because they were preoccupied with the new toy boats they had somewhat insensitively been given. That same newspaper article also gave insight into the tragedy's underlying class divide. When asked by the reporter whether the boys could be properly identified by tracking the tickets purchased by their father, Hayes' father replied that he had never travelled second class or steerage, so did not know. The survival rates between the various classes of passengers aboard the Titanic was dramatically different, with 201 of the 324 first-class travellers making it off the ship alive, but only 181 of the 708 third-class travellers surviving. Michel Jr. much later realised that he and Edmond had been extremely lucky, commenting that amidst the vast differences of people's wealth on the ship, if they hadn't been in second class, they would have died. The publicity surrounding the Titanic disaster eventually saved the boys, as their photographs appeared in newspapers all around the world. Their mother Marcel, at home in France and with no clue as to where her sons had disappeared to, noticed their photo in the morning paper and, just over a month later, reunited with them in New York and took them back to France. Michel Jr., who became a philosophy professor, is known as the oldest surviving male of the infamous sinking, dying in 2001 at the age of 92. His brother Edmond became an architect, but having been a prisoner of war during World War II, his health declined and he passed away in 1953. The story of the so-called Titanic orphans was one happy ending amongst the hundreds of sad accounts from the Titanic. Masabumi Hosono. The only Japanese person aboard the Titanic was civil servant Masabumi Hosono. He had been in Russia researching its public transport, and he boarded the Titanic for home as a second-class passenger. At the time of the collision, he was asleep in his cabin and awoken by a steward's frantic knock and the clatter of panicked footsteps in the hallway. However, Hosono was blocked from going to the Titanic's boat deck where lifeboats were already being launched because a crewman assumed him to be a third-class passenger. The officer stated that because he was a foreigner, he would have to wait on the lower deck. Hosono later wrote that the scene was terrifying and chaotic, with passengers scurrying back and forth and white flashes exploding above as the crew set off emergency flares. Finally arriving at the lifeboats, he was again turned away, but alternating between contemplating his own demise and the hope of seeing his wife and children again, he suddenly sought any chance of survival. From one of the rapidly filling lifeboats came the call that it had space for another 2 passengers, and another man hopped in. Hosono had felt that he should go down with the ship, but quickly joined the man in the lifeboat, which pulled away to the echoing screams of those drowning. Hosono ultimately endured condemnation in both the US and Japan for taking a space on a lifeboat and not relinquishing his life. He was falsely described as a stowaway in one account and wrongly accused of disguising himself as a woman. After making it home, Hosono was temporarily sacked from his government job and denounced in the press as dishonourable, immoral and cowardly. His ostracism brought shame to his family even long after his death in 1939. Later research showed that he had helped others to lifeboats before him and acted no differently from other Western male survivors. His powerful memoir is the only one first penned on Titanic letterhead, which was in his pocket when he began writing it on the rescue ship Carpathia. Years later, with the 1997 film Titanic, honour was restored to his family, to the relief of his grandson, Haruomi Hosono, who is a leading member of the band Yellow Magic Orchestra. Noelle Leslie. Already known as a countess and philanthropist, Noelle Leslie probably made her greatest mark on history by taking charge of one of the Titanic lifeboats and helping steer it to safety. A relatively hands-on aristocrat who had trained in nursing, she was travelling with the intention of joining her husband, the Earl of Rothes, who was in the US and Canada on business. Lady Rothes, as she was known, manned the tiller on Lifeboat 8, steering it clear of the massive sinking liner. Helping to command the lifeboat in concert with able seaman Tom Jones, who had swiftly decided to employ her leadership skills, Rothes took the helm for over an hour, then assisted in rowing it for hours towards the rescue ship. In the meantime, she was trying to console and calm a young Spanish newlywed whose husband had disappeared into the wreck. She also tried to boost the morale of her fellow passengers by leading them in singing songs, all cheering when the Carpathia was sighted. Once on board the rescue ship, Rothes continued caring for the passengers, devoting herself to the women and children from steerage, the poorest passengers, and sewing clothes for their babies. After her return to dry ground, Lady Rothes shied away from the publicity and fame that rightly touted her heroism and was quoted as saying, "I have done nothing." She praised other occupants of the lifeboat, in particular the cool-headedness of seaman Tom Jones, with whom she maintained a regular correspondence. She gave him and steward Alfred Crawford inscribed silver pocket watches. In return, Jones sent her the brass number plate from their lifeboat, and the pair continued to exchange letters until her passing in 1956.
Number 6, Seabird, 1750. In 1750, a 300-ton merchant ship called Seabird was on its way back to its home port of Newport, Rhode Island, after a trip to Honduras under the command of Captain John Durham. The ship was spotted drifting listlessly off the Rhode Island coast before running aground on Eastern Beach. The Seabird seemed to be in perfect working condition. When it was boarded, the ship's dog happily greeted the crew, and there was also a cat aboard, where both of the animals were in perfect health, relaxed and well fed and uninjured. However, these were the only two remaining living things on this ship, as there was no crew aboard. Strangely though, there were signs that the crew had just recently been there. A freshly prepared breakfast was set out on the table, coffee was boiling in a pot, and there was even the smell of recent tobacco smoke pervading the air. In the captain's quarters, they found a large stash of coins just lying untouched. The ship itself was completely undamaged, and its cargo was totally intact and properly secured. Wherever the crew had gone, they'd gone there in a hurry. But what had happened to them? The weather was calm and clear. It had been broad daylight. The ship was in perfect working order, and another boat captain would claim that he had passed the Seabird just 2 hours before the ship was found abandoned and seen Captain Durham on deck, and they had waved at each other with no sign of anything even slightly amiss. The only possible clue seemed to be the fact that the ship's longboat was missing, although a smaller boat was still there. There was also a note written in the captain's log which read, "Branton Reef sighted," which is located not far from Newport. The mystery has never been solved, and no trace of the crew of the Seabird nor the missing longboat was ever found. Number 5. Mary Celeste, 1872. The Mary Celeste was an American merchant ship discovered adrift and deserted in the Atlantic Ocean off the Azores Islands, Portugal, on December 5, 1872. The Canadian ship De Gracia found her in a dishevelled but seaworthy condition with a lifeboat missing. The last entry in her log was dated 10 days earlier. She had left New York City en route to Genoa in Italy on November the 7th, 1872. On board were Benjamin Sooner Briggs, one of the owners and the ship's captain, his first mate Albert Richardson, the captain's wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 6 crewmen, all considered to be experienced and trustworthy. When discovered, she still had 6 months' provision of food and water still on board, and the captain and crew's personal belongings were undisturbed. However, one thing was clear: those on board had abandoned the vessel in a hurry. One major theory as to what happened is that something happened on the Mary Celeste that made the captain panic, where he then ordered the crew to get onto the lifeboat and abandon ship. The rope was then tied to the lifeboat, and the captain and his crew trailed behind the Mary Celeste to see what would happen to her. The panic had possibly turned out to be a false alarm, but unfortunately for Captain Briggs, his family and crew, the rope must have snapped during the raging storm, and they were unable to get themselves back to the Mary Celeste, or quite possibly the lifeboat was overturned in the storm and they all drowned. Whatever the speculation as to what happened to those who had been on board, they were never seen or heard from again. The inconclusive hearings fostered much speculation and fantasy, from seaquakes, waterspouts, attacked by a giant squid, or that they were abducted by aliens. Number 4. The Resolven, 1884. The Welsh ship the Resolven was travelling between Canada and Wales with a cargo of fish and timber under the command of Master Mariner John James. In August of 1884, the Royal Navy vessel HMS Mallard was patrolling off of Trinity Bay, Newfoundland, when they spotted the Resolven aimlessly adrift. All attempts to hail the ship went unanswered, and it was decided to go in and investigate the wandering vessel. When the Resolven was boarded, it was found that no one was aboard, although there was clear signs of recent activity all around. In the galley, there was food and drinks carefully laid out on tables for a meal, and even a fire burning. There was no sign of damage to the ship or any evidence of a struggle, and everything seemed as if someone would be returning at any moment. The only thing out of place were a missing lifeboat, and a small fortune in coins was also found to be missing. Other than that, everything was normal. The missing coins may point to foul play, but they also may have been just taken along by the captain when he left the ship, for whatever reason that may have been. The crew has never been found. The reasons for why they would so suddenly abandon the ship was never resolved, and the case is so mysterious that the resolvent has been sometimes referred to as the Welsh Mary Celeste. Number 3. J.C. Cousins, 1883. The J.C. Cousins was a 66-foot luxury schooner that operated out of Astoria, New York, guiding boats around the treacherous sandbars of the Columbia River. On October 6, 1883, the J.C. Cousins went out to anchor off Peacock Spit near the entrance of the river, where they would wait to aid any ships that were in need. Later that afternoon, the J.C. Cousins was seen to be behaving strangely by a tugboat called the Mary Taylor. Crew of the tugboat observed that the schooner was on the move, which seemed strange as there was no ships in the area, and so no one would have needed their help at that time. Even stranger still was that instead of moving through the ample calm water all around, the boat was heading straight to an area where there were dangerous breakers. Fortunately, the J.C. Cousins made it through the breakers, then headed out towards the open sea. But then, in another strange move, started to turn around to head back. But then, in another strange twist, turned again to head back out towards the ocean. It was bizarre behaviour, and the boat continued to go back and forth in this manner until nightfall. When morning came, it was found to be in this continuous loop, presumably having done so all night long. At this stage, spectators had gathered on the shore, looking confused and bewildered at what was going on. J.C. Cousins continued this loop until around 1 p.m, when it finally ran aground on a sandbar and fell on its side like an exhausted animal. Because the tide was still high, no one was able to board the ailing ship, and there was no sign of any crew attempting to exit the ship. The J.C. Cousins just sat there lifeless upon the beach. When the boat was finally boarded, it was found to be deserted. The lifeboats were missing, and some of the paperwork was missing as well. So, had the crew intensely abandoned the vessel? And if this is the case, how is it they were not seen, even though the boat had gone out to its position as normal and had been visible the whole time? Other theories as to the crew's disappearance was that they were murdered to eliminate competition. Other ideas were that there'd been a mutiny for some reason, or that they'd been kidnapped. Other bizarre notions were that they'd been attacked by a sea monster, or could have been the victims of a ghost ship that was rumoured to prowl the area. One old local claimed to have seen a phantom vessel stalking them. But these were just wild conjectures. To this day, it is not known what happened to the crew of the J.C. Cousins, or at what point they exited the boat, or why. Number 2. Carol A. Deering, 1920. The Carol A. Deering was a schooner which departed from Norfolk, Virginia on September the 8th, 1920, on its way to deliver a cargo of coal to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The cargo was delivered in late November. The schooner then headed back on December the 2nd, stopping off at Barbados to pick up supplies on January the 9th. At this stage, everything went according to schedule, but then things started to get strange. During the ship's stop in Barbados, there'd been growing friction between one of the crew and the ship's captain, Captain W.B. Wormel. According to First Mate Charles B. McClellan, the frustration stemmed from the fact that Captain Wormel, who had been a last-minute replacement for a William M. Merritt who was suddenly taken ill, seemed to be an incompetent leader. First Mate McClellan and Wormel did not get along, and things became so heated between the two in Barbados that McClellan had threatened the captain's life, leading him to being arrested and detained. In all of this chaos, the Carol A. Deering still sailed from Barbados on its way to becoming another great maritime mystery. A few weeks after its departure, a transmission was picked up from the ship by the Cape Lookout lightship, during which time a man with a foreign sounding accent allegedly explained the ship had lost one of its anchors. The captain of the Cape Lookout lightship claimed that the crew of the Caroline Deering had been acting oddly and wandering about on the deck as if in an agitated state. Then, just 2 days later, on the morning of January the 31st, 1921, the ship was found drifting aimlessly off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, where it became stuck on a sandbar. When the ship was boarded by the Coast Guard, they found the vessel to be completely empty, with no sign of any of the crew members. And in addition, it was found that all of the lifeboats, the navigation equipment and the crew's belongings were gone as well. The only thing left behind was a half-prepared meal, as if they'd all abandoned ship in a hurry. There were other oddities as well, where the captain's personal quarters had 3 different sets of footprints littering the floor, possibly indicating that there had been intruders. On the captain's deck was a navigational chart, which, starting from January the 23rd, had suddenly changed to a completely different person's handwriting. Other than that, there were no clues at all as to what could have happened to the crew, and no trace of them was ever found. There have been many theories as to what became of the crew of the Caroline Deering, where the most rational explanation seems to be that there had been a mutiny aboard, as Captain Wormel had apparently not been the most popular guy among his crew, and he and his first mate had been at each other's throats since Barbados. But if there'd been a mutiny, why would they have abandoned a perfectly good ship in the lifeboats along with all their gear? Other theories claim that they were attacked by pirates or smugglers, that they had all vanished in the region of the Bermuda Triangle. Nevertheless, it remains as yet another enduring sea mystery. Number 1. The Cas 2, 2007. Not all nautical mysteries happened in the dark past. There are also modern shipping mysteries, and none more so than what happened on April the 20th, 2007. The Cas 2 was a 9.8 metre catamaran that was discovered drifting off the coast of eastern Australia near the Great Barrier Reef, with its engine still running. When authorities boarded the ship, they found no one aboard, yet all of the life jackets were accounted for, the radio was fully operational, a smaller escape boat was still tied up and secured, and food was set out on the table for a meal. The laundry was hanging out to dry, fishing lines were laid out, there was even a laptop computer sitting on a table, open and turned on. Nothing appeared to be missing, with even a firearm and ammunition left behind in a box. The interior of the boat was neat and tidy. There was no sign of struggle or foul play. The yacht appeared to be in good order, and the whole scene was eerily calm and normal, except for the fact there was no one there. The Cas 2 had been headed for Townsville, and that there had been 3 crew members consisting of Derek Batten, 56, and friends Peter Tunstead, 69, and James Tunstead, 63, all of whom were from Perth, Western Australia. The trio had apparently departed from Airlie Beach off the Queensland coast in eastern Australia and had planned to head out from Townsville to embark on an ambitious voyage up around the northern coast to end up back home in Western Australia, a destination they would never reach. A video taken by the crew dated April the 15th, 2007 was found, which showed the 3 men on the deck of the ship apparently enjoying themselves and not under any sort of duress. The only potential clues that could really be gleaned from the video was that the seas seemed to be somewhat choppy and the men were not wearing life jackets. There was an intensive search for the missing men using both boats and aircraft, which scoured the region of the last named GPS coordinates of the vessel on both land and sea, utilising advanced equipment such as infrared systems up and down the coastline. Despite these massive efforts, no trace for the missing men was found, and it was feared that they had not survived. So, what happened to the crew of the Cas 2? The crew were experienced mariners and had been on many trips aboard the Cas 2 without incident. The boat was also reported to have been in good condition and perfectly seaworthy with no prior problems. The official theory was that the crew of the Cas 2 had been swept overboard either by a sudden gust of wind or rough seas, but this is not known for sure, and indeed the pristine state of the cabin does not seem to suggest such a sudden, jarring tragedy or drenched interior. There was also no sign that any of the life-saving gear had been equipped or taken, and no distress call, which would mean that if such an incident had really occurred, that it must have dispatched all three of them with alarming swiftness. There was also the idea that the CAS-2 may have run aground on a sandbar, and when the crew had disembarked to free it, they'd been washed out to sea. Now there is a theory that the CAS-2 met with some other vessel and they went on board only to be kidnapped. However, all of these ideas are wild speculation. The only thing everyone appears to have agreed upon is that there was no obvious evidence at all that foul play had been involved aboard the vessel. Yet another perplexing conundrum that follows a similar pattern to so many other sea mysteries. The RMS Titanic, along with everything inside of her, rested at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean for 8 decades before it was discovered and later salvaged by underwater excavation teams. These pieces of history are now giving viewers a rare glimpse of life aboard the vessel, as well as a look at some of the ghostly spirits still haunting the doomed ship. The Titanic Artifact Exhibition, located at the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, has proven to be a breeding ground for paranormal activity. There are over 300 displays at the exhibit, some of which apparently maintained their connection to the passengers that once possessed them. Scary stories about the exhibits continue to pour in from staff at the exhibit and visitors alike. Here are 6 of the spookiest Titanic ghost stories. Number 6. The Lady in Black. Eyewitnesses have seen a ghost wandering the grand staircase of the Titanic Artifact Exhibition of the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Both guests and employers at the exhibit claim to have seen the woman, who is dressed in a black period dress with a white collar and her hair done up in a bun. A photographer preparing for the opening of the exhibit spotted the woman walking down the staircase. The photographer was startled at first because he hadn't seen anyone else enter the area, and the staircase itself had been roped off. He shrugged it off and assumed that she was just a part of the exhibit about to take place. He asked if she would like to be photographed, but she ignored him. He continued setting up his equipment, and the woman suddenly appeared behind him. He offered once again to photograph her, and this time she did a little more than just ignore him. She vanished into thin air, right in front of him. Number 5. The exhibit ghosts. A number of guests and workers at the exhibit have felt, heard and seen paranormal activity while inside the exhibition. This paranormal activity includes feelings like someone is following behind you, and there have been sightings of actual ghosts. One of the most bizarre events at the exhibition happened with a photo of Bruce Ismay, who was an English businessman and chairman and managing director of the White Star Line that owned the Titanic. As the morning crew opened up the exhibit, they found a photo of Bruce Ismay laying on the floor, leaning against a wall, and completely undamaged. The manager of the exhibit reviewed surveillance footage to discover how this photo wound up there and who placed it there, but the footage only created more questions than answers. He watched as the picture started shaking and was then very gently moved to the floor, but no one was around. It had seemingly moved itself. Number 4. The Curse of the Titanic. A number of claims that the Titanic was cursed emerged after it sank. The press were quick to link this Titanic curse with the fact that White Star Line, the company behind the ship, didn't christen their ships before launching them. The most popular legend about the curse is linked to the sectarianism of Belfast itself, the city the ship was constructed in. It was suggested the ship was given the number 390904, which spells out the letters No Pope when reflected. The term No Pope was a sectarian slogan used to attack Roman Catholics. It was popular among the extreme Protestants of Northern Ireland, where the ship was constructed. The region was particularly sectarian at the time, and so it was alleged that the ship sinking was because the people putting her together, the Harland and Wolff Company, were anti-Catholic. Their workforce was almost exclusively Protestant, and the company had a history of alleged hostility towards Catholics. The company were known to hire very few Catholics, but it's unknown if this was a deliberate anti-Catholic move on their part because their Belfast-based shipyard was in Protestant East Belfast, which is probably why very few Catholics were involved with the building of the ship. The RMS Olympic and Titanic were next to each other on the yard, given the numbers 400 and 401 respectively. This was an obvious case of Protestant versus Catholic superstition, as the RMS Olympic was in service for almost 25 years without any curse attached. Number 3. The Lookout Watcher. Frederick Fleet was a British sailor who served as the lookout for the RMS Titanic. He saw the deadly iceberg and issued a warning to the bridge. This warning came too late, however, as the ship was going much too fast to avoid colliding with the ice. Fleet would survive the sinking of the Titanic, but he suffered from depression afterwards. Following the death of his wife not long after Christmas in 1964, Fleet was evicted by his brother-in-law and committed suicide by hanging himself in the garden. Fleet's grave was unmarked until 1993, when the Titanic Historical Society had a headstone erected for him. It seems that the spirit of the Lookout Watcher isn't at peace though. Witnesses claim that they have seen him keeping watch over the promenade deck of the Las Vegas exhibition, perhaps driven by guilt to maintain his vigil even in death. Number 2. The Ghost of Captain Smith. According to the owners of the former home of Captain Edward John Smith, the captain of the Titanic, the ghost of the shipmaster still lives in the house. The couple, Neil and Louise Bonner, owned the 19th century Victorian and rented it out, where tenants of the property reported feeling an icy chill pass through them, hearing unexplained noises and even seeing an apparition of the captain himself. There's also been flooding in the kitchen and unexpected gusts of wind in the dining room. Mr. Bonner says that they were once renting out the place to a man who lived by himself. The man called them to tell them that he had seen the ghost of Captain Smith drifting across the room while he laid in bed. Number 1. The Belfast Museum Ghost. The Irish like to say that although they built the Titanic, it was sunk by the English. The Titanic Belfast Museum pays homage to the ship in Belfast, Ireland, and the place seems to have a haunting presence of its own. A woman going through a tour of the museum in 2013 listened to the final distress call sent out by the Titanic. She described what happened to her next in a letter that she sent to the hosts of the Real Ghost Stories online podcast. The woman claimed that as she was listening to the Morse code and reading translated sounds of the distress call, she found herself overwhelmed with emotion. Her heart raced and she suddenly felt so heartbroken and anxious. It was as if she was the radio controller sending out the call, knowing it was too late. She felt sick to her stomach and began to cry. She walked away from the exhibit to get some air and felt a hand on her shoulder and a reassuring male voice tell her it's okay. She assumed that the voice came from her friend, and she reached up to brush his hand and then realised there was no one standing there. Had she been contacted by the spirit of Jack Phillips, the actual radio controller? Was he giving her some reassurance that he came to terms with the tragedy and was at peace now? Number 7. John Pedder. The crew of the Queen Mary were running a routine emergency drill early on July 10th, 1966. 18-year-old crew member John Pedder was near the engine room during the drill, and he attempted to squeeze his way through door 13 as it was completing its 60-second closing process. Pedder made a grave miscalculation about how long the door had left to close, and the poor boy was crushed to death by the door. His body was nearly severed in two. Pedder is now affectionately known by the name Half-Latch Harry, and he can sometimes be spotted in the corridors and elevators around the engine room. Visitors to Shaft Alley, the narrow passage between the store and the engine room, report being followed by a bearded man in dated work overalls. They report that this man will suddenly disappear near door 13, the door that killed young Pedder. There are several other claims, including people having their clothes and purses grabbed, banging on pipes, and also greasy handprints appearing seemingly out of nowhere. Former tour guide for the Queen Mary, Nancy Ann, discussed her own encounter with the ghost of Pedder. "I don't know why I turned around, but I turned around, and standing right behind me on the step was a man. He had on blue overalls and they were dirty. When I stepped aside to let him go by, he wasn't there. He was gone. Did Nancy feel Pedder's presence? Was that what made her turn around? What happened to the man she saw? If it wasn't a ghost, then where did he disappear to?" Number 6. Dana. There are a number of tragic tales dotted throughout the history of the Queen Mary. One of the most tragic stories involves room B474 and what is reported to have happened in there. It is said that a man strangled his wife and child and left their lifeless bodies on the bed. He then made his way to the bathroom and shot his other daughter, who was in there, before taking his own life. Some people say that the daughter from the bathroom continues roaming the corridors of the Queen Mary ever since the incident. The girl, who was referred to by the name Dana, reportedly haunts the archive and cargo areas of the Queen Mary. People report being able to hear her playing and hiding among the crates. Ghost hunters are known to investigate the cargo area in the hope of finding a lost girl, and claim that they have found proof she exists in the form of misty shadows and ghostly orbs that appear in the photos they take of the area. Visitors to the ship have also reported spotting Dana wandering around the second-class pool, crying out for the mother, who she lost many years ago. Number 5. Woman by the pool. As well as young Dana haunting the second-class pool, there is said to be a distinctive presence lingering among the first-class pool. During times when the area is at its quietest, visitors report seeing the infamous woman in a bathing suit. It's hardly an intimidating name for a ghost, of course, but it's hard to deny what an accurate description it is of the wandering ghost. Unfortunately, the passenger history of the Queen Mary is too dense to identify one particular woman. It is said that the woman appears to be in her late 20s or early 30s and wears a 1930s style bathing suit. Visitors often see the woman heading to the changing rooms, and she occasionally walks along the edge of the pool. Some say that they can see footprints and puddles appear before the ghostly woman does, as if they're heralding her arrival. Number 4. John Henry. It's rumoured that a man by the name of John Henry died near the generator room while he was working as a member of the construction crew putting the Queen Mary together in the 1930s. These days, the area is plagued by unexplained noises and reported sightings of a shadowy figure. People who go inside the room report being touched, having their cheeks brushed, and feeling pulled or pushed on. People have also reported seeing a man's spirit looking down on them through a hole in the ceiling and then disappearing as soon as it is noticed. The most common sounds heard in the area are clanks and taps on the wall, which are said to be consistent with the sounds made by men working on a ship. Is John Henry still working on the ship, even in death? Number 3. Jacqueline Turing. There are a number of famous spirits said to be wandering the Queen Mary, and perhaps the most famous is that of a girl named Jackie. While we don't know for sure if Jacqueline Turing did indeed drown in the second-class pool, she has apparently continued to frighten guests and investigators alike for decades. Jackie is the most commonly recorded spirit on the Queen Mary and is known to audibly answer questions and leave behind EVP or electronic voice phenomena exchanges. Tour guides on the Queen Mary will often attempt to coax Jackie into singing a little song for the guests. Sometimes she will. That must be a great bonus for anyone she sings to. Jackie is a playful spirit, and she will often interact with visitors in the first and second class pool areas. Plenty of visitors have claimed to hear Jackie giggling and laughing, singing and splashing in the pool, and asking people if they know where her parents and her teddy are. Some guests report hearing Jackie play with other children. Kathy Love, a maintenance supervisor for the Queen Mary, recounts one experience that she had with Jackie. We came into the pool and I heard giggling, the sound of a little girl playing in the area. And at that point I noticed there was splashing. The splashing stopped, the giggling continued, and we observed the wet footprints of a small child walking across the locker room. I know that I saw what I saw. I'm not exactly sure why I saw it, but I know it was there. Number 2, the Lady in White. Another famous spirit is the Lady in White. Her origins are not known, but what we do know is that she's seen frequently dancing her nights away in a dark corner of the Queen's salon, which was formerly known as the First Class Lounge. The Lady in White is also said to hang around near the piano in the lobby. The piano used to be in the lounge, which may explain her attachment to it. The Lady in White is said to be a young and beautiful woman wearing a stunning white evening gown from the 1930s. When the lady isn't dancing, she can be seen by guests heading towards the lobby, walking through corridors and disappearing near the elevators. The Queen Mary is known for ghost tours, and the lady is known to appear during these tours. Number 1, Room B340. There are a total of 355 rooms in the Queen Mary, and most of them are considered to be haunted. When guests check in, they are presented with a list of rooms that reportedly have paranormal activity associated with them by the front desk. Of the 12 decks of the Queen Mary, the B deck is considered to be a central hub of supernatural energy and activity. In particular, room B340. There have been persistent complaints about strange noises, footsteps, faucets being turned off and on, hangers in the closet moving by themselves, furniture moving by itself, voices, and guests being touched, the comforter of the bed being ripped off, and several other incidents. The situation got so bad that management were forced to close room B340. Even though the room is no longer available for guests to stay for the night, the activity has continued, and so the room was stripped completely bare in the hope of solving the problem. However, guests in nearby rooms still report hearing unusual noises and claim to see full-bodied apparitions appear before them, before disappearing through the walls into nearby room B340. It's not known for sure what is causing all the problems at B340. There is one story that suggests a staff member was murdered in the room, and their spirit now drives out anyone who tries to stay in the room.
Monica O'Hara was born and brought up in Ireland and later moved to Liverpool, England. Monica is a medical journalist and a graphologist and is now in her late 70s. She had 3 children and now lives with her second husband, Joe Keaton, in Liverpool. When Monica was a child, she attended a convent and was taught by nuns. One particular nun taught her about Pythagoras, which would have been unusual for a nun because she also told her that Pythagoras was interested in the transmigration of souls or reincarnation. This kindled a flame in young Monica. However, Catholic faith does not believe in reincarnation, and one day in religious class, when Monica broached the subject of reincarnation, she was sent out of the classroom and made to stand in the corridor for being a heretic. As Monica was growing up, she would have regular nightmares where she was in a small room surrounded by dark water that was slowly rising up around her. Fortunately, she would always wake up before the water rose above her head. In this dream, she had no idea where she was. She also had another dream, where she was on a ship with an old cage lift. At this stage, she had not linked either of the dreams. She would regularly have other dreams, with one in particular that featured a large white country house with Doric columns. Doric columns are Greek-inspired architecture that is wider at the base than the top, not unlike the White House in Washington, D.C. The grounds are spacious with many animals. She had the feeling that she lived there. On another occasion, she is actually inside the building looking out at the scenery. In another dream, she is at the seaside surrounded by many people on a promenade with a hotel in the background. The hotel closely resembled the Waldorf Astoria in New York that she had seen photographs of. There were people sitting on benches wearing long dresses. She assumed she was a young woman who was staying with her parents in the hotel. The dreams were regular occurrence throughout her childhood and into adulthood, but it never occurred to her that they were all connected. One fear that has always been with her since childhood was a deep fear of water, particularly dark, still water. If she were in a scenario where there were stars in the sky and dark water underneath, she would run away in a panic. She was not particularly afraid of boats, but she did ensure she stayed away from the edges. One event in history that continued to fascinate her was that of the Titanic, which at times had become an obsession. Over the years, her interest grew stronger, and at one time in 1987, she met an old sailor who happened to have some records of the passengers on the Titanic. As Monica had studied graphology, or the way a person writes by hand, she was fascinated by the handwriting of passengers on the Titanic and did an analysis of them. This in turn brought her into contact with the British Titanic Society, along with 2 Titanic societies in America. Monica said that when you study handwriting, you're also probing into people's minds. This allowed her to study in detail the people who went down with this ship. In 1985, Monica was hypnotically regressed in the hope of curing her fear of water. In her first regression, she was told to keep going back until she saw something of interest. She felt herself going through a tunnel of darkness before getting a strong impression that she was on the promenade deck of a large ship, and it was night time. She was sitting on a deck chair with a blanket over her and was freezing cold. She was asked who she was, but all she could say was la, was unable to say a name. Monica felt strange because she felt she had one foot in the present but another foot in the past, but had a strong feeling for the person in the deck chair. When she was brought out of the regression, she was shivering from the cold from the ship she was on. After undergoing many more regressions, they were able to piece together a story as to who she actually was in a past life. That she had been a young girl of about 17 who had lost her life on the Titanic when it sank in 1912. On what she said on hypnosis, it appears that she had run away from home and was travelling under another name, so was unable to accurately check on the passenger list records. But what convinced Monica of a past life was when she actually visited some locations from that life. She had recognised certain places and knew her way around. As the character of the young girl slowly evolved, they discovered that she was extremely snooty and arrogant and difficult to communicate with. She lived in a large house in Cornwall in southern England and had been a lonely child. She had no brothers or sisters and was brought up by a governess who she hated. Her father was very friendly with the governess, which she disliked. The reason it was difficult to find her real identity was because she did not want anyone to know her real name. When Monica was regressed to the young woman, she actually took on a persona. It was not until they were able to regress her back to the age of 6 or 7 that they were able to get her real name, which was Lucy Latimer, whose father was supposedly a baron. She was insistent that her first name, Lucy, was spelt with an I-E and not a Y, and her surname was spelt with a Y and not an I. After tracing her surname, they found that it had been spelt 3 different ways. Strangely, Monica had always loved the name Lucy. Lucy had a boyfriend called Steady, who had been working as a casual labourer around the house. There were strong suspicions that Lucy had eloped with the young man. Monica decided to visit a town in County Cork called Cobb, which was the last sailing point for the Titanic, and as soon as she arrived, she found it totally familiar. One of her dreams had been going up a hill in a horse and carriage and arriving in a hotel. As soon as she arrived in the town of Cobb, she immediately had a feeling that there should be a horse and cart. The hills she encountered was the same in her dream. Everything around her was the same as in her dreams. Interestingly, it was the last place in her dream before embarking on a new adventure. Unfortunately, it would be the last few days of her life. As she walked around the town, past memories of the smells enveloped her. She looked for a hotel she stayed in and inquired about a canopied walkway. Although the canopy no longer existed, she was shown an old photo of the walkway and the canopy, which she immediately recognized. Some places she immediately recognized, but other places she did not. She went to one place for a cup of tea and thought, "My God, this is the place." At the time, it was for poor people, and she and Stenny had stayed there as they had no money. It was the image of her dreams. Monica believed she travelled first class, but then realised she travelled steerage for poor people. On further research on the existence of Lucy, in 1990 they sent out a teletext about Lucy Latimer. Mrs. Alice Lewis ran the British Titanic Society and believed they were talking about Eleanor Truelove Latimer, who had run away to sail on the Titanic. Eleanor was headstrong and brought up on a farm in Cornwall. So where did the name Lucy come from? An 18-year-old man called Arthur Stenning worked as a farm labourer for the Latimers and was keen on Eleanor. In April 1912, Eleanor and some friends were to visit an aunt in St. Austell. Eleanor told them she was meeting a friend in Probus and would meet them at her aunt's. But she never arrived that evening. When her father went to the docks in search of her, he found that the ship had already sailed. He later found out about their relationship and found that Arthur Stenny had a brother in Philadelphia, which is where they were probably going. They were never seen or heard from again. After further research, they were able to track down a house in Cornwall where a family called the Latimers had resided, called Lanarth. Lanarth was now a hotel in the village of St. Kew Highway, Cornwall. She immediately recognised it as being the view in her dreams. She did not recognise the front of the building, but was familiar with the back. She inquired about a missing door in the dining area and was told it had been bricked up, and she immediately recognised the music room. Like many cases of reincarnation, many of their dreams or regressions can become clouded with false memories. That is not to say that the events never took place, but trying to recall something that happened many lifetimes ago could be difficult to accurately pinpoint. Monica O'Hara Keaton wrote a book titled I Died on the Titanic, along with other books on graphology and self-healing.
From the early days of Violet Jessup's life, she showed every indication of being a survivor. Born in Argentina of Irish immigrant parents, she was the first of 9 children, of whom only 6 survived infancy. As the eldest child, she was often expected to care for her siblings, and her resilience shone through even in childhood. She suffered from tuberculosis as a young girl, and despite doctors' predictions that her condition would be fatal, she survived it. By age 16, following the loss of her father and the family's return to England, she was still caring for her siblings and eventually became the breadwinner at age 21. Following in her mother's footsteps, she became a maritime stewardess. As well as being her family's pillar of strength, Violet also survived the most horrific ocean disaster on record, the sinking of the luxury liner RMS Titanic. Even more impressive is that this stoic woman also survived the subsequent collisions of the Titanic's duo of sister ships, the RMS Olympic and the HMHS Britannic. The early 1900s were a rocky time for the White Star Line, but Violet Jessop was able to weather the storm of events. In 1911, after serving as a stewardess with the Royal Mail Line for 2 years, Jessop obtained a job aboard the RMS Olympic. The Olympic was a luxury British ocean liner and the lead ship of the White Star Line's illustrious trio, as well as being the largest civilian liner in the world at the time. In the fall of that year, the Olympic departed port in Southampton and promptly collided with a British cruiser, the HMS Hawke. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, and the gutted and flooding Olympic was able to limp back to port without sinking. Strangely, Jessop was to gloss over this collision in her memoirs. After experiencing the traumatic impacts of the damaged Olympic, it would be understandable if Jessup were permanently turned off transatlantic sea journeys. However, within 7 months, she returned to work with the White Star Line with a new job on what they touted as the most unsinkable ship. In 1912, Jessup boarded the ill-fated RMS Titanic as a stewardess 4 days before his catastrophic encounter with the iceberg in the North Atlantic Sea. In her later memoirs, she recounts her activities during the 2 hours and 40 minutes between the collision and the ship's final submersion. She was sent up on deck to act as a model of behaviour for the other staff, in communicating with the non-English speakers who had difficulty understanding the instructions being provided. "I was ordered up on deck," she recalled. Calmly, passengers strolled about. I stood at the bulkhead with the other stewardesses, watching the women cling to their husbands before being put into the boats with their children. Sometime after, a ship's officer ordered us into the boat first to show some women it was safe. She calmly observed as the lifeboats were loaded by crew and was finally ordered into lifeboat 16, where as the boat was lowered, she was handed a baby to look after by a ship's officer. After spending the whole night in the lifeboat, Jessup and her fellow survivors were saved by the RMS Carpathia. Happily, while on board the rescue ship, a woman whom she assumed to be the baby's mother grabbed the infant from her and disappeared without a word. Still undaunted, despite witnessing the mass tragedy of the Titanic and spending hours in a freezing lifeboat, Violet Jessup continued to pursue her vocation as a maritime stewardess. Come 1916, in the midst of World War I, the White Star Line adapted some of their vessels for use as hospital ships. One of these converted liners was the HMHS Britannic, where Jessup was stationed serving as a stewardess with a voluntary aid detachment of the British Red Cross. Early on November the 21st, the Britannic suffered a mysterious explosion in the Aegean Sea near the Greek island of Kea. The massive blast took the lives of 37 people and caused the ship to rapidly sink within less than an hour. British authorities at the time speculated that the ship was either struck by a torpedo or triggered a mine planted by German forces. The reason for the unexplained blast was not to be discovered for another 100 years, when in 2016 deep-sea divers finally determined that the ship must have struck a deep-sea mine. In her memoirs, Jessup describes witnessing the frightening scene from a lifeboat. The white pride of the ocean's medical world dipped ahead a little, then a little lower, and still lower, she recounted. All the deck machinery fell into the sea like child's toys. Then she took a fearful plunge, her stern rearing hundreds of feet into the air, until with a final roar, she disappeared into the depths. Jessup's life was also in danger. As the ship descended, his propellers were still churning and started to suck lifeboats beneath the stern. Jessup clambered out of a lifeboat to safety, but in doing so, sustained a traumatic head injury. "I leapt into the water, but was sucked under the ship's keel, which struck my head," she later wrote. Relating the incident in her memoirs, "I escaped, but years later when I went to my doctor because of a lot of headaches, he discovered I had once sustained a fracture of the skull." Having faced the challenges of one near sinking and 2 actual disastrous ship sinkings, many expected Violet Jessup to retire from a maritime career. However, she seemed addicted to the seafaring life when, after a brief respite, she returned to her duties with the White Star Line in 1920. She later joined the Red Star Line, completing 2 around-the-world cruises on former troopship and company's largest luxury liner, Belgenland. She even returned for a stint with the White Star Line when it rebranded itself as the Royal Mail Line. Violet Jessup had a brief marriage before retiring to Great Ashfield in Suffolk, where this courageous survivor passed after a long and vibrant life at the age of 83. It is not known whether Jessup met another miraculous survivor whose experiences run parallel to hers, the so-called unsinkable Stoker. Born in the same year as her, 1887, Arthur John Priest was an English fireman and stoker on board ships. These handy men, called the Black Gang, did the backbreaking work of shoveling coal into steam-powered ships' boilers while withstanding the intense heat of the furnaces for hours at a time. While also requiring a lot of brawn, this was a highly skilled job, as the firemen had to estimate just the right amount of coal to feed into the flames to maintain the ship at the correct speed, more than 600 tons of coal in a day. Priest survived not only the Titanic's sinking, but also that of no fewer than 4 other ships, which included the Asturias, the Alcantara, and the Britannic, as well as several other ships which were involved in maritime collisions. Priest had counted himself lucky to have found a job on Titanic's maiden voyage, unlike many other stokers who were laid off due to the coal strike of 1912. At the time of the collision with the iceberg, Priest was off duty and resting between shifts, in quarters deep inside the ship. His survival of the Titanic sinking was miraculous, in that the fireman had a long way to go to climb from the boiler rooms up to the deck of the massive liner. Travelling up to the deck took him and other crew members of the Black Gang via a labyrinth of gangways and passages before they finally reached the top level. The odds against Priest's survival were slim, not only due to his physical location but also his social position within the ship. By the time the stokers emerged into the freezing night air, most of the lifeboats were already dispatched. Those of their number who survived, 44 in total, swam for their lives throughout the icy water, wearing only the shorts and vests of their work attire, and resulting in Priest suffering frostbite. Luckily, the men managed to reach safety, and one historical record says that he probably ended up in lifeboat number 15. Priest went on to serve in World War I, working on board the merchant cruiser Alcantara. In February 1916, Alcantara challenged the German raider Greif, which had been disguised as a Norwegian vessel. As Alcantara intercepted the ship, the Greif crew opened fire, resulting in a brief but ferocious close-range onslaught. The intensive battle concluded with the sinking of both ships. That day, more than 70 of Priest's shipmates perished, and he only narrowly avoided loss of his own life, receiving shrapnel wounds. When Priest recovered from his injuries, his return to work was on board Britannic, Titanic's other, even larger sister. The converted liner, come hospital ship, was transporting wounded soldiers back to Britain through the Mediterranean. Having already survived the collision on the Olympic and the Titanic sinking, Priest assumed trepidation in joining the third of the celebrated White Star liners must have felt grimly justified with his explosion and downing to the sea floor. Once again, Priest emerged from the inner depths of a foundering ship with his life intact, as had Jessup on the same occasion. Priest's fourth maritime disaster occurred on the 17th of April 1917. He was a stoker on board the hospital ship Donegal, which was torpedoed and sank in the English Channel. He sustained a head injury and, after being awarded the Mercantile Marine Ribbon for his wartime services, appeared to become, understandably, a confirmed landlubber. While he did not again serve in the war or practice his trade, he later lamented that men refused to sail with him, claiming that he brought bad luck. The Bermuda Triangle, that notorious wedge-shaped area of the Western Atlantic Ocean, is the subject of chilling legend as a devourer of dozens of ships, planes, and human lives. Many theories have been put forward for the sinister reputation of the triangle, which skirts Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where it is said that the number of disappearances far exceeds the laws of chance. Some say that extreme gravitational and magnetic deviation causes radios to fail and compasses to provide wrong readings. Others blame radiation from submerged, still functioning machinery from an ancient civilization. In fact, the legend of the Bermuda Triangle seems to have originated relatively recently in an Argosy article written by Vincent Gaddis in 1964, which sparked a massive speculative writing worldwide. Alternatively, mythbusters like researcher Lawrence Kush have also been at work to prove that phenomena experienced in the triangle are statistically no more prevalent than in similar ocean areas. But the unnerving and unexplained occurrences still persist in the public awareness, such as the accounts of the following two incidents. SS Marine Sulphur Queen, an astonishing time and location warp mystery, emerged in relation to a small expedition into the caves of Tham Lod in Pang Mapha, Thailand in 1897. A group of American explorers, headed by Colonel Anthony Turnbull, entered the cave system as part of their world travels to investigate first-hand mysterious natural locations. It was the third of their expeditions when they reportedly entered the caves on the morning of November the 12th, 1897. They carried with them ladders, strong ropes, hooks, 3 days of essential provisions, and 2 muskets. One of their number, William Cartwright, later told how after an hour within the cave complex, they came upon a small hole in the east wall of one of the caverns, an aperture barely big enough for a man to fit through. After lowering down a lantern, they ascertained that there was solid ground about 12 feet below the opening. They assembled their climbing hooks and propelled themselves down through the opening, where they found a sizable subterranean layer. Cartwright later reported that the vast cavern was pitch black and occupied by massive stalagmites and stalactites which extended from floor to ceiling. As the men continued clambering through the eerie complex of natural formations, they began to hear some odd scratching sounds emanating from the surrounding tunnels. They concluded that the noises must come from bats or some kind of insect, the eerie echoing amplified by the cave walls. However, they were soon shocked to see that the sounds came from unusually large spiders of a scale they claimed would easily span the width of a man's chest. Luckily, the giant spiders were wary of the men and scuttled away into holes in the cave walls. The men did recover a discarded leg husk from one of the creatures, but its authenticity was later disputed. On reaching the far end of the cavern, the adventurers discovered another opening which was surrounded by the distinct marks of human footprints, as well as a furrowed groove which indicated the use of a thick rope. Again, they eased their lanterns into the hole, revealing another floor over 20 feet beneath them. Lowering themselves down, they perceived a strange odour of iron and rotting wood, and as they wandered through the lower cavern, they discovered strange artefacts which included broken wooden beams, chain links, and several small unrecognisable coins. They continued trekking towards the northern end of the cave, where they discovered the astonishing sight of a huge wooden cog, measuring over 15 feet in diameter, and which seemed to be fixed to the cave floor. The cog had a weighty rope wound around its spindle, the rope lying loose across the cavern floor until it was abruptly redirected underground. The men then put a lot of time and effort into clearing dried mud away from the cog, which they were finally able to start turning. As they did, the rope became taut and the men then started to dig away the ground from around the rope, eventually finding that the rope was attached to a large slab. To their amazement, they found that the slab had strange features, being uncannily smooth and unlike any other stone with which they were familiar. They realised, in fact, that the slab was constructed out of metal with an even surface and a dull grey colour. Tapping on the slab revealed a soft but distant echo, indicating that something must lie below it. Unable to lift the heavy slab with the cog, the team returned the following day with 10 additional local men they had hired. They were finally able to turn the cog sufficiently to lift the metal slab, and after raising it to a workable height, they shoved beams and rocks around it to stabilise it. They were then able to lower their lanterns again into a further dark void below. They were shocked to realise that this next cavern below was so enormous that only the light of their lamps could be spotted in the massive space. One of the local men tossed the stone into the hole, and they heard merely a faint thud after a delay of several seconds. As they resumed lowering their lanterns, Turnbull suddenly noticed that on the metal surface near the opening there was some white paint, and he and others started brushing away the dirt covering it. They uncovered the partial lettering of INE and SUL under the dirt. Cartwright reports that soon after this, one of the men accidentally dropped this lamp into the void below. The lamp smashed on the distant floor beneath them and spewed out a mass of what they described as blue fire, which engulfed the space below. The blue flames illuminated the entire cavern, and Cartwright later recounted smelling a dreadful and irritating odour issuing from the cave. In the eerie glow, he could see what lay down there. Hundreds of wooden boxes scattered all over the ground, ropes strung throughout the vast area, and a huge anchor. The blue flames enveloped the space and surged upwards through the men's entry hole. The group hastened to escape the massive fire, but on returning to the surface, found that 4 of their number had not made it. After the terrifying incident, 4 more expeditions returned to the cave, but the lower caverns were obliterated, having completely collapsed into solid earth. For years after, the explorers insisted that what they discovered was an enormous ship, but they were never taken seriously. No further insight was gained on the mystery until a ship called the SS Marine Sulphur Queen went missing in the Bermuda Triangle while travelling to deliver its cargo of 15,000 tonnes of molten sulphur. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen and its crew of 39 disappeared near the southern coast of Florida in the now infamous Bermuda Triangle. However, the date it went missing was February the 4th, 1963, nearly 66 years after its astonishing sighting in the Thai cave. On December the 5th, 1945 at 2 p.m, 5 US Navy aircraft, TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, departed from a naval air station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for a routine 3-hour patrol exercise and practice bombing runs. The aircraft, collectively known as Flight 19, were all crewed by experienced pilots and Marines. Most of them had logged about 300 hours of flight, and they were led by Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, veteran of multiple combat missions in World War II's Pacific Theatre. The operation was proceeding smoothly, as had the 18 prior flights, until, on turning north, Taylor communicated his concern that his Avenger's compass was malfunctioning and that the patrol seemed to be flying in the wrong direction. The confusion compounded after a storm front blew in, which brought rain, strong winds and heavy cloud cover. Flight 19 became dangerously disoriented. Taylor notified base that the Avengers were lost. "We don't know which way is west. Everything is wrong, strange. We can't be sure of any direction. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." Later, another pilot conveyed his unease over the radio. "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." The last message was, "We must be about 225 miles northeast of base. It looks like we are," followed by silence. 2 hours after leaving base, the squadron had simply vanished. Immediately, 2 30-man Martin Mariner flying boats were sent out to assist, but after a few transmissions, one of those planes also fell silent. At dawn the following day, the Navy assigned over 300 boats and aircraft to search for Flight 19 and the missing Mariner. The intensive air-sea rescue operation worked for 5 days, scouring more than 300,000 square miles of ocean, but found nothing. They just vanished. Navy Lieutenant David White later reported, "We had hundreds of planes out looking, and we searched over land and water for days. No trace of the Avengers or the Mariner. Either debris or human remains could be found, although the hapless Mariner was later thought to have exploded in midair after a report from a witness. A Navy Board of Inquiry conducted a thorough investigation but uncovered nothing, and eventually attributed the mysterious disappearances to causes or reasons unknown. Other strange circumstances surrounding the incident included the apparent initial reluctance of Taylor to take out the flight and his request to be excused, as if due to some uncanny premonition. Also still unexplained is why none of the crew members of Flight 19 made use of their rescue radio frequency or their plane's ZBX receivers, which could have guided them towards Navy radio towers on land. The pilots were instructed to switch the devices on, but they either missed the message or did not acknowledge it. The perplexing mystery appeared to have been solved when in June 1991, newspapers worldwide reported the discovery of Flight 19, the legendary Lost Squadron. 5 aircraft were located on the seafloor by a high-technology vessel from the Scientific Search Project, which was looking for sunken Spanish galleons. Clear video pictures were broadcast of the 5 planes, which rested at a depth of 500 feet and in a tight formation as if they had dropped from the sky while under control. Affording some hope, they were identified as 5 Avengers, although they were only 10 miles off Fort Lauderdale, and so therefore much closer to base than Flight 19 when radio contact was lost. However, on examination, they were found to be of an earlier model than the Flight 19 planes, and with serial numbers that did not match. Thus, the enigma deepened, and questions around the fate of all 6 in total Flight 19 aircraft and their 27 crew members continued to be asked. One of the most baffling mysteries in nautical history took place in 1872, with the disappearance of 10 crew and passengers from the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brigantine. However, over the years, there have been many other similar mysteries at sea where the crew and passengers completely vanished. The following are 4 such stories. Rosalie, 1840. Rosalie was a large French merchant ship that was built in 1838 and was made up of 222 tons of timber. In 1840, the Rosalie had been en route from Hamburg to Havana with a cargo of wine, fruit, silks and other various items. However, the Rosalie was discovered in the Atlantic Ocean with sails fully set and appeared to be on course to a destination. However, there was one very big problem. There was absolutely nobody on board. When the ship was boarded, they found a canary along with hens and a cat, and the poor creatures were all half-starved. Overall, the ship was in good condition as it continued to sail on a relatively calm ocean. All of the produce was in perfect condition, and when they checked the captain's cabin, all of the papers were secure and in place. The soundings gave 3 feet of water in the hold, but there was no leak whatsoever. When the other cabins were checked, they found them furnished with several articles along with the ladies' toiletries, together with a quantity of ladies' clothing, which had been thrown hastily together, all showing that the cabins had only recently been deserted. So where was the captain, crew and passengers, as there appeared to be no reason for the ship to have been deserted? Everything on board was in tip-top condition with no leaks, and there was plenty of food and water. There was no sign whatsoever of a violent attack, such as pirates, as there was no sign of a struggle, no traces of blood. Proof that there had been no criminal intent was the fact that the cargo, all valuables and any money, was still on board and everything was untouched. Every single person on board had mysteriously vanished without a trace, and no trace of them was ever found. James B. Chester, 1857. On February the 28th, 1855, about 1,100 kilometres southwest of Azores, a region of Portugal in the mid-Atlantic, a merchant ship sighted the barque James B. Chester sailing in an erratic manner, and when they signalled the vessel, they got no response. The ship was first boarded by mate Thomas, who found the ship completely deserted, but there were signs that the ship had been involved in some sort of struggle, where the cabins had been ransacked and the tables and chairs had been overturned. The clothing had been scattered along with books, and the ship's papers and the ship's compass were missing. However, if the ship had been assailed by pirates, they were not after goods, as the cargo and provisions had not been taken. There were many questions asked as to why the ship had been abandoned and what had happened to the crew and passengers. If there had been a pirate attack, where were the violent signs of a struggle, such as blood? If the crew themselves had looted the ship, what they had taken was not worth abandoning the ship in the middle of a huge ocean.
Other questions asked whether the crew had panicked in a storm and jumped into the lifeboats or left because they were terrified for some unknown reason, but there were also claims that none of the boats were missing. Like many incidents where they were unable to find answers, rumours abound where the crew murdered the captain and fled and was picked up by a Dutch ship called the Two Friends. The crew was later picked up in Savannah and arrested for murder. Another rumour was that rum was to blame for the whole incident, resulting in a drunken frenzy where panic then ensued. As with many maritime mysteries that take place on an ocean miles from anywhere, finding reliable truth and evidence is extremely difficult. Resolven, 1884. SV Resolven was a 143-ton brigantine built from softwood in Nova Scotia. In the 1880s, she was principally a carrier, and the main cargo was fish. On the 27th of August 1884, Resolven left Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, and set sail for Snug Harbour in Labrador. On the 27th of August, she was spotted by a British naval vessel, HMS Mallard, off the coast of Catalina, where her sails were spread and it was steering in a strange manner in relatively calm waters 63 miles from a destination in Labrador. The British vessel then signalled the ship, but got no reply. The captain of HMS Mallard then sent a boarding party to inspect the Resolven. When the officers and men boarded the ship, they found it deserted with no sign of life. However, there had been signs of recent activity as ashes in the galley were still warm and there was food prepared and the lamps were still burning. One side of the ship appeared to have sustained some minimal damage. The last entry in the logbook had been written 6 hours before being sighted. However, there were no signs of damage either by natural events or a recent skirmish. The officers and crew spotted a large iceberg nearby and theorised that because none of the 7 crew members or 4 passengers were familiar with the northern waters, they believed they may have panicked when the ship was damaged by ice and may have overreacted and launched a lifeboat. However, no bodies were found. But the captain, crew and passengers were nowhere to be found, and they had somehow vanished into thin air. Seemingly, they had taken off in the ship's lifeboat, and they were in a hurry. The ship was towed into the nearby port, refitted, and put out to sea again. The mystery of this ship earned it the nickname the Welsh Mary Celeste. Unfortunately, the ship was doomed when 3 years later, the Resolven with its cargo of timber was wrecked while returning to Newfoundland from Nova Scotia. After official inquiries as to the fate of the ship or its crew and passengers, they could find no substantial reason why they had suddenly abandoned the ship. Carroll A. Deering, 1921. Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted commercial schooner that was launched on April 4, 1919 in Bath, Maine. On August 22, 1920, the schooner set sail from Norfolk, Virginia with a crew of 10 men and a cargo of coal, and it set sail for Rio de Janeiro. A few days later, the captain, William H. Merritt, suddenly fell ill and was quickly replaced by Captain W.B. Wormel. However, the ship continued without too much delay and managed to deliver its cargo on time and was not due to return until December. However, on January 29, 1921, she was spotted by the lighthouse keeper, Captain Jacobson, aboard the Cape Lookout lightship in North Carolina. Then an unidentified crewman aboard the Carroll A. Deering contacted the lightship, informing that the ship had lost its anchors. Captain Jacobson duly acknowledged this, but was unable to report it as his radio was not working. But the captain did note strange behaviour of the crew of the Carroll A. Deering, who were milling around on the foredeck looking suspicious. Then 2 days later, on the morning of January 31st, the schooner was spotted by C.P. Brady of the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard Station and reported that it had run aground on Diamond Shoals, which extends many miles out from Cape Hatteras and is considered to be one of the most dangerous spots on the Atlantic seaboard. The schooner's sails were still set, but its lifeboats were missing and where the crew had obviously abandoned the schooner. Rough seas had prevented any surf boats from initially reaching the wreck, but they were eventually able to board the schooner on February 4, 1921. As expected, they found that the crew members had abandoned the ship along with their personal belongings, navigational equipment and papers. Strangely though, after an extensive inquiry by the FBI, they could find no trace of the crew along with the ship's log. They had completely vanished. Today, the mystery of the Carolee Deering is one of the most discussed maritime mysteries of the 20th century. As to the schooner's fate, along with its crew and remains an unsolved mystery. There were many wild and unfounded rumours, but nothing substantial was ever proved and remained a mystery that was never solved. Speculation continues even to the present, and no satisfactory explanation for the crew's disappearance has ever been proven. The Carolee Deering was scuttled and sunk in March 1921 to prevent it from becoming a shipping hazard.
Setting sail from the docks in Southampton, England, the British passenger ocean liner named the RMS Titanic embarked on her maiden voyage on April 10, 1912, her planned destination, New York City. The massive luxury liner was operated by the innovative shipping company White Star Line and commandeered by Captain Edward John Smith. With 2,224 souls on board, the ship sailed majestically across the cold North Atlantic waters until it ran into a massive iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, thereby sustaining irreparable damage. Just a few hours later, the famously unsinkable ship broke apart and descended into the icy ocean, taking over 1,500 victims down with her. Here are some of the most well-known passengers who were impacted by the tragedy, either as survivors or victims. Molly Brown, an American socialite and philanthropist whose husband had struck it rich in the mining industry, Molly Brown was then known for her showy hats and gregarious personality. While enjoying her wealth, she also spent her life contributing to society, advocating for the rights of women and the importance of children's education. Although she was known as Maggie during her lifetime, posthumously the world came to know her as the unsinkable Molly Brown after her reported bravery during the Titanic disaster. According to survivors' accounts, Brown helped board other passengers into lifeboats during the evacuation and later helped to steer her own lifeboat number 6. Portrayed by Kathy Bates in the 1997 Titanic movie, Brown was seen to argue with the quartermaster that they should return to the wreckage to rescue more survivors. She even threatened to push him and his crew overboard if they did not go back, which they didn't. Captain Edward John Smith. Even after going down with his ship, Captain Edward John Smith was unable to avoid controversy. Despite being one of the world's most experienced sea captains, many blamed him for the Titanic's demise, with critics faulting him for approving the ship to travel at nearly its maximum speed, despite reports of ice in that area. It was later acknowledged that Smith was abiding by standard maritime practice, and at that time, ice was viewed as fairly harmless. Even when previous ocean liners had encountered head-on collisions, any damage had been recoverable. Reports varied widely on how Smith, played by Bernard Hill in Titanic, responded to the imminent sinking of the ship. Some eyewitnesses saw him actively assisting women and children onto the lifeboats while making all efforts to prevent panic. Others described him later becoming paralysed with fear and neglecting measures that may have saved more lives during the evacuation. At the last, he was believed to have done a final sweep of the ship's deck and imparted this simple instruction to his crew: "Well, boys, do your best for the women and children and look out for yourselves." His body was never recovered. John Jacob Astor IV. Real estate developer, inventor and lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War, John Jacob Astor IV was the richest passenger on board the Titanic, with a personal wealth of $87 million when he met his fate on the foundering ship. Friends of Molly Brown, he and his pregnant wife Madeline had booked the journey on the Titanic, wanting to return to the US to ensure that their baby would be born there. According to those present, Astor clung to the side of a raft, but as he froze to death in the sub-freezing conditions, he let go and drowned. When rescuers recovered his body, they found multiple gold and diamond accessories and over $2,400 on him. Benjamin Guggenheim. Mining magnate Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the ill-fated vessel with his staff and his mistress, French singer Leontine Aubar. The couple shared a cabin with his valet, Victor Gilliot, and slept through the initial iceberg collision, only later realising the seriousness of the incident. After both had dressed and he had assisted Aubar and some of his staff to enter lifeboat number 9, he reassured his fearful maid, "We shall soon see each other again. This is just a repair. Tomorrow the Titanic will continue on again." After realising that there were insufficient lifeboats and that they would not be rescued, Guggenheim and Gilliot changed into their evening wear and entered the grand staircase area, with Guggenheim remarking, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He wrote a message, later delivered to his wife, saying that his last thoughts would be of her and their 3 daughters. His and Gilliot's bodies were never recovered. J. Bruce Ismay, survivor. As the highest-ranked official, chairperson and director of the White Star Line, the English businessman J. Bruce Ismay had also authorised the planned number of lifeboats reduced from 48 to 16. When he jumped into collapsible sea, the last and 9th lifeboat lowered into the Atlantic before the Titanic sank 20 minutes later, he condemned himself to spending the remainder of his days as a pariah. The American press savaged him, naming him coward of the Titanic, while stories circulated that he was even to blame for the sinking, having supposedly pushed for an increase in speed to surpass their scheduled arrival time and gain positive publicity. The scathing criticism against him in the US was also thought attributable to his falling out with newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst just prior to the tragedy. An official British investigation affirmed Ismay's defence that he boarded the last lifeboat only after all available women and children had been rescued. However, London society also ostracised him. While opting for a secluded life, he still did not shirk his responsibilities. Played by Jonathan Hyde in the film Titanic, Ismay spent his remaining career paying out insurance claims to victims' family members, and his own family today insist he was unfairly persecuted. Cosmo and Lucy Duff Gordon. Like Ismay, high society British couple Sir Cosmo and Lucy Lady Duff Gordon became notorious for surviving the Titanic. The first-class couple and Lucy's secretary were among only 12 people who escaped in lifeboat number 1, which had a capacity of 40. The women had earlier declined places in 2 other lifeboats for women and children because Lucy refused to be separated from her husband. Lady Duff Gordon was a well-known British fashion designer who later related that a few men who crowded in the boat were turned back at the point of Captain Smith's revolver and several felled in the process. Similarly, Cosmo was attacked by the US press for not complying with the women and children first order. But the wealthy landowner claimed there were no women and children around when the boat was lowered into the water. He was also maligned for bribing a crewman on his lifeboat with £5 into not rescuing people struggling in the water for fear they would tip over the boat. Cosmo insisted he only gave the crewman money to make up for his material loss. Despite official vindication by the Board of Trade inquiry, public perception that the Duff Gordons had acted selfishly tainted the couple for the rest of their lives. The musicians. Travelling as second-class passengers, the 8 musicians who performed on the Titanic are possibly some of the most honoured victims of the tragedy. Led by violinist Wallace Hartley, the band members played uplifting music throughout the long, bitterly cold night to calm passengers as they frantically rushed to the lifeboats. Although with the same rights as anyone else on board, the band members chose to stay together and play until the very end. One second-class passenger later commented, "Many brave acts were done that night, but none more brave than those of the men playing minute after minute as the ship sank quietly lower and lower into the sea." The music they played served as much as their own immortal requiem and their right to be memorialised on the scrolls of undying fame. Isidor and Ida Strauss. German-born Isidor Strauss had risen from poverty to become a co-owner of Macy's department store and a member of the US House of Representatives for the state of New York. As the Titanic disaster unfolded, Isidor had an opportunity to access a lifeboat but refused to do so, maintaining that every woman and child must be evacuated first. His devoted wife, Ida, gave her maid her fur coat and insisted that she board a lifeboat, rejecting her husband's pleas to board the boat. She told him, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go," and the couple were last seen on deck arm in arm. Although they died together on the Titanic, only Isidor's body was recovered. Melvina Dean. At only 9 weeks old, Melvina Dean was the youngest passenger on board, becoming the youngest survivor and also the longest living, passing away in 2009. Dean, with her older brother and parents, were travelling on the doomed ship as third-class passengers. The British family had made plans to emigrate to Wichita, Kansas, where her father was planning to co-own a tobacco shop with relatives. Their lives were to change course when the iceberg hit the Titanic. Although the small baby, her mother and brother were amongst the first third-class passengers to board the lifeboats, Dean's father was to perish and his body was never recovered. Instead of proceeding with the family's original plan, Dean's grieving mother returned to England with the 2 small children, and Dean became a popular media doyenne for some time. She went on to work as a government cartographer during World War II, and later in life was active in commemorating the victims of the Titanic. She died in 2009, aged 97, the last survivor of perhaps the world's most tragic and famous commercial maritime disaster.